Book 2, Chapter 16 of Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wars of the Jews by Josephus. Translated by William Whiston. Book 2, Chapter 16. Cestius sends Neopolitanus the tribune to see in what condition the affairs of the Jews were. Agrippa makes a speech to the people of the Jews, that he may divert them from their intentions of making war with the Romans. 1. However, Florus contrived another way to oblige the Jews to begin the war, and sent to Cestius, and accused the Jews falsely of revolting from the Roman government, and imputed the beginning of the former fight to them, and pretended they had been the authors of that disturbance, wherein they were only the sufferers. Yet were not the governors of Jerusalem silent upon this occasion, but did themselves write to Cestius, as did Bernice also, about the illegal practices of which Florus had been guilty against the city; who, upon reading both accounts, consulted with his captains what he should do. Now some of them thought it was best for Cestius to go up with his army, either to punish the revolt, if it was real, or to settle the Roman affairs on a surer foundation, if the Jews continued quiet under them. But he thought it best himself to send one of his intimate friends beforehand, to see the state of affairs, and to give him a faithful account of the intentions of the Jews. Accordingly, he sent one of his tribunes, whose name was Neopolitanus, who met with King Agrippa as he was returning from Alexandria, at Jamnia, and told him who it was that sent him, and on what errands he was sent. 2. And here it was that the high priests, and men of power among the Jews, as well as the Sanhedrim, came to congratulate the king upon his safe return; and after they had paid him their respects, they lamented their own calamities, and related to him what barbarous treatment they had met with from Florus. At which barbarity Agrippa had great indignation, but transferred, after a subtle manner, his anger towards those Jews whom he really pitied, that he might beat down their high thoughts of themselves, and would have them believe that they had not been so unjustly treated, in order to dissuade them from avenging themselves. So these great men, as of better understanding than the rest, and desirous of peace, because of the possessions they had, understood that this rebuke which the king gave them was intended for their good. But as to the people, they came 60 furlongs out of Jerusalem, and congratulated both Agrippa and Neopolitanus. But the wives of those that had been slain came running first of all and lamenting. The people also, when they heard their mourning, fell into lamentations also, and besought Agrippa to assist them. They also cried out to Neopolitanus, and complained of the many miseries they had endured under Florus; and they showed them, when they were come into the city, how the marketplace was made desolate, and the houses plundered. They then persuaded Neopolitanus, by the means of Agrippa, that he would walk round the city with one only servant, as far as Siloam, that he might inform himself that the Jews submitted to all the rest of the Romans, and were only displeased at Florus, by reason of his exceeding barbarity to them. So he walked round, and had sufficient experience of the good temper the people were in, and then went up to the temple, where he called the multitude together, and highly commended them for their fidelity to the Romans, and earnestly exhorted them to keep the peace; and having performed such parts of divine worship at the temple as he was allowed to do, he returned to Cestius. 3. But as for the multitude of the Jews, they addressed themselves to the king, and to the high priests, and desired they might have leave to send ambassadors to Nero against Florus, and not by their silence afford a suspicion that they had been the occasions of such great slaughters as had been made, and were disposed to revolt, alleging that they should seem to have been the first beginners of the war, if they did not prevent the report by showing who it was that began it. And it appeared openly that they should not be quiet, if anybody should hinder them from sending such an embassage. But Agrippa, although he thought it too dangerous a thing for them to appoint men to go as the accusers of Florus, yet did he not think it fit for them to overlook them, as they were in a disposition for war. He therefore called the multitude together into a large gallery, and placed his sister Bernice in the house of the Asamoneans, that she might be seen by them, which house was over the gallery, at the passage to the upper city, where the bridge joined the temple to the gallery, and spake to them as follows. 4. In this speech of King Agrippa we have an authentic account of the extent and strength of the Roman Empire when the Jewish war began. And this speech, with other circumstances in Josephus, demonstrate how wise and how great a person Agrippa was, and why Josephus elsewhere calls him a most wonderful or admirable man. He is the same Agrippa who said to Paul, "Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian," Acts 26:28, and of whom St. Paul said, "He was an expert in all the customs and questions of the Jews." See another intimation of the limits of the same Roman Empire in Of the War. But what seems to me very remarkable here is this, that when Josephus, in imitation of the Greeks and Romans, for whose use he wrote his Antiquities, did himself frequently he into their they appear, by the politeness of their composition, and their flights of oratory, to be not the real speeches of the persons concerned, who usually were no orators, but of his own elegant composure, the speech before us is of another nature, full of undeniable facts, and composed in a plain and unartful but moving way. So it appears to be King Agrippa's own speech, and to have been given Josephus by Agrippa himself, with whom Josephus had the greatest friendship. Nor may we omit Agrippa's constant doctrine here, that this vast Roman Empire was raised and supported by divine providence, and that therefore it was in vain for the Jews, or any others, to think of destroying it. Nor may we neglect to take notice of Agrippa's solemn appeal to the angels here used, the like appeals to which we have in St. Paul, 1 Timothy 5:22, and by the apostles in general in the form of the ordination of bishops. Had I perceived that you were all zealously disposed to go to war with the Romans, and that the purer and more sincere part of the people did not propose to live in peace, I had not come out to you, nor been so bold as to give you counsel. For all discourses that tend to persuade men to do what they ought to do are superfluous, when the hearers are agreed to do the contrary. But because some are earnest to go to war because they are young, and without experience of the miseries it brings, and because some are for it out of an unreasonable expectation of regaining their liberty, and because others hope to get by it, and are therefore earnestly bent upon it, that in the confusion of your affairs they may gain what belongs to those that are too weak to resist them, I have thought proper to get you all together, and to say to you what I think to be to your advantage; that so the former may grow wiser, and change their minds, and that the best men may come to no harm by the ill conduct of some others. And let not any one be tumultuous against me, in case what they hear me say do not please them; for as to those who admit of no cure, but are resolved upon a revolt, it will still be in their power to retain the same sentiments after my exhortation is over. But still my discourse will fall to the ground, even with a relation to those who have a mind to hear me, unless you will all keep silence. I am well aware that many make a tragical exclamation concerning the injuries that have been offered you by your procurators, and concerning the glorious advantages of liberty. But before I begin the inquiry, who you are that must go to war, and who they are against whom you must fight, I shall first separate those pretenses that are by some connected together. For if you aim at avenging yourselves on those that have done you injury, why do you pretend this to be a war for recovering your liberty? But if you think all servitude intolerable, to what purpose serve your complaint against your particular governors? For if they treated you with moderation, it would still be equally an unworthy thing to be in servitude. Consider now the several cases that may be supposed, how little occasion there is for your going to war. Your first occasion is the accusations you have to make against your procurators. Now here you ought to be submissive to those in authority, and not give them any provocation. But when you reproach men greatly for small offenses, you excite those whom you reproach to be your adversaries. For this will only make them leave off hurting you privately, and with some degree of modesty, and to lay what you have waste openly. Now nothing so much damps the force of strokes as bearing them with patience; and the quietness of those who are injured diverts the injurious persons from afflicting. But let us take it for granted that the Roman ministers are injurious to you, and are incurably severe. Yet are they not all the Romans who thus injure you; nor hath Caesar, against whom you are going to make war, injured you. It is not by their command that any wicked governor is sent to you, for they who are in the west cannot see those that are in the east. nor indeed is it easy for them there even to hear what is done in these parts. Now it is absurd to make war with a great many for the sake of one, to do so with such mighty people for a small cause; and this when these people are not able to know of what you complain. Nay, such crimes as we complain of may soon be corrected, for the same procurator will not continue forever, and probable it is that the successors will come with more moderate inclinations. But as for war, if it be once begun, it is not easily laid down again, nor borne without calamities coming therewith. However, as to the desire for recovering your liberty, it is unseasonable to indulge it so late; whereas you ought to have labored earnestly in old time that you might never have lost it. For the first experience of slavery was hard to be endured, and the struggle that you might never have been subject to it would have been just; but that slave who hath been once brought into subjection, and then runs away, is rather a refractory slave than a lover of liberty. For it was then the proper time for doing all that was possible, that you might never have admitted the Romans into your city, when Pompey came first into the country. But so it was, that our ancestors and our kings, who were in much better circumstances than we are both as to money and strong bodies, and valiant souls, did not bear the onset of a small body of the Roman army. And yet you, who have now accustomed yourselves to obedience from one generation to another, and who are so much inferior to those who first submitted, in your circumstances will venture to oppose the entire empire of the Romans; while those Athenians, who, in order to preserve the liberty of Greece, did once set fire to their own city, who pursued Xerxes, that proud prince, when he sailed upon the land and walked upon the sea, and could not be contained by the seas, but conducted such an army as was too broad for Europe, and made him run away like a fugitive in a single ship, and break so great a part of Asia at the Lesser Salamis, are yet at this time servants to the Romans; and those injunctions which are sent from Italy become laws to the principal governing city of Greece. Those Lacedaemonians also who got the great victories at Thermopylae and Plataea, and had Agesilaus for their king, and searched every corner of Asia, are contented to admit the same lords. Those Macedonians also, who still fancy what great men their Philip and Alexander were, and see that the latter had promised them the empire over the world, these bear so great a change, and pay their obedience to those whom moreover 10,000 other nations there are, who had greater reason than we to claim their entire liberty, and yet do submit. You are the only people who think it a disgrace to be servants to those to whom all the world hath submitted. What sort of an army do you rely on? What are the arms you depend on? Where is your fleet, that may seize upon the Roman seas? And where are those treasures which may be sufficient to your undertakings? Do you suppose, I pray you, that you are to make war with the Egyptians, and with the Arabians? Will you not carefully reflect upon the Roman empire? Will you not estimate your own weakness? Hath not your army been often beaten even by your neighboring nations, while the power of the Romans is invincible in all parts of the habitable earth? Nay, rather they seek for somewhat still beyond that; for all Euphrates is not a sufficient boundary for them on the east side, nor the Danube on the north; and for their southern limit, Libya hath been searched over by them as far as countries uninhabited, as is Cadiz their limit on the west. Nay, indeed, they have sought for another habitable earth beyond the ocean, and have carried their arms as far as such British islands as were never known before. What therefore do you pretend to? Are you richer than the Gauls, stronger than the Germans, wiser than the Greeks, more numerous than all men upon the habitable earth? What confidence is it that elevates you to oppose the Romans? Perhaps it will be said, it is hard to endure slavery. Yes, but how much harder this is to the Greeks, who are esteemed the noblest of all people under the sun. These, though they inhabit in a large country, are in subjection to 6 bundles of Roman rods. It is the same case with the Macedonians, who have juster reason to claim their liberty than you have. What is the case of 500 cities of Asia? Do they not submit to a single governor, and to the consular bundle of rods? What need I speak of the Henlochi, and Colchi, and the nation of Tari, those that inhabit the Bosporus, and the nations about Pontus, and Maeotis, who formerly knew not so much as a lord of their own, but are now subject to 3,000 armed men, and where 40 long ships keep the sea in peace, which before was not navigable, and very tempestuous? How strong a plea may Bithynia and Cappadocia, and the people of Pamphylia, the Lycians, and Sicilians, put in for liberty? But they are made tributary without an army. What are the circumstances of the Thracians, whose country extends in breadth 5 days' journey, and in length 7, and is of a much more harsh constitution, and much more defensible than yours, and by the rigor of its cold sufficient to keep off armies from attacking them? Do not they submit to 2,000 men of the Roman garrisons? Are not the Illyrians, who inhabit the country adjoining, as far as Dalmatia and the Danube, governed by barely 2 legions? By which also they put a stop to the incursions of the Daans. And for the Dalmatians, who have made such frequent insurrections in order to regain their liberty, and who could never before be so thoroughly subdued, but that they always gathered their forces together again, revolted, yet they are now very quiet under one Roman legion. Moreover, if disadvantages might provoke any people to revolt, the Gauls might do it best of all, as being so thoroughly walled around by nature; on the east side by the Alps, on the north by the river Rhine, on the south by the Pyrenean mountains, and on the west by the ocean. Now although these Gauls have such obstacles before them to prevent any attack upon them, and have no fewer than 305 nations among them, nay have, as one may say, the fountains of domestic happiness within themselves, and send out plentiful streams of happiness over almost the whole world, these bear to be tributary to the Romans, and derive their prosperous condition from them; and they undergo this, not because they are of effeminate minds, or because they are of an ignoble stock, as having borne a war of 80 years in order to preserve their liberty, but by reason of the great regard they have to the power of the Romans, and their good fortune, which is of greater efficacy than their arms. These Gauls, therefore, are kept in servitude by 1,200 soldiers, which are hardly so many as are their cities. Nor hath the gold dug out of the mines of Spain been sufficient for the support of a war to preserve their liberty, nor could their vast distance from the Romans by land and sea do it, nor could the martial tribes of the Lusitanians and Spaniards escape; nor more could the ocean with its tide, which yet was terrible to the ancient inhabitants. Nay, the Romans have extended their arms beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and have walked among the clouds, upon the Pyrenean mountains, and have subdued these nations. And 1 legion is a sufficient guard for these people, although they were so hard to be conquered, and at a distance so remote from Rome. Who is there among you that hath not heard of the great number of the Germans? You have, to be sure, yourselves seen them to be strong and tall, and that frequently, since the Romans have them among their captives everywhere. Yet these Germans, who dwell in an immense country, who have minds greater than their bodies, and a soul that despises death, and who are in rage more fierce than wild beasts, have the Rhine for the boundary of their enterprises, and are tamed by 8 Roman legions. Such of them as were taken captive became their servants; and the rest of the entire nation were obliged to save themselves by flight. Do you also, who depend on the walls of Jerusalem, consider what a wall the Britons had; for the Romans sailed away to them, and subdued them while they were encompassed by the ocean, and inhabited an island that is not less than the continent of this habitable earth, and 4 legions are a sufficient guard to so large an island. And why should I speak much more about this matter, while the Parthians, that most warlike body of men, and lords of so many nations, and encompassed with such mighty forces, sent hostages to the Romans? Whereby you may see, if you please, even in Italy, the noblest nation of the East, under the notion of peace, submitting to serve them. Now when almost all people under the sun submit to the Roman arms, will you be the only people that make war against them? And this without regarding the fate of the Carthaginians, who, in the midst of their brags and the nobility of their Phoenician original, fell by the hand of Scipio. Nor indeed have the Cyrenians, derived from the Lacedaemonians, nor the Marmaridite, a nation extended as far as the regions uninhabitable for want of water, nor have the Syrtes, a place terrible to such as barely hear it described, the Nasamons and Moors, and the immense multitude of the Numidians, been able to put a stop to the Roman valor. And as for the third part of the habitable earth, Africa, whose nations are so many that it is not easy to number them, and which is bound by the Atlantic Sea and the Pillars of Hercules, and feeds an innumerable multitude of Ethiopians as far as the Red Sea, These have the Romans subdued entirely. And besides the annual fruits of the earth, which maintain the multitude of the Romans for 8 months in the year, this, over and above, pays all sorts of tribute, and affords revenues suitable to the necessities of the government. Nor do they, like you, esteem such injunctions a disgrace to them, although they have but one Roman legion that abides among them. And indeed what occasion is there for showing you the power of the Romans over remote countries, when it is so easy to learn it from Egypt, in your neighborhood? This country is extended as far as the Ethiopians, and Arabia the Happy, and borders upon India. It hath 7,500,000 men, besides the inhabitants of Alexandria, as may be learned from the revenue of the poll tax. Yet it is not ashamed to submit to the Roman government, although it hath Alexandria as a grand temptation to a revolt, by reason it is so full of people and of riches, and is besides exceeding large, its length being 30 furlongs, and its breadth no less than 10. And it pays more tribute to the Romans in 1 month than you do in a year. Nay, besides what it pays in money, it sends corn to Rome, that supports it for 4 months in the year. It is also walled around on all sides, either by almost impassable deserts, or seas that have no havens, or by rivers, or by lakes. Yet have none of these things been found too strong for the Roman good fortune. However, 2 legions that lie in that city are a bridle both for the remoter parts of Egypt, and for the parts inhabited by the more noble Macedonians. Where then are all these people whom you are to have for your auxiliaries? Must they come from the parts of the world that are uninhabited? For all that are in the habitable earth are under the Romans. Unless any of you extend his hopes as far as beyond the Euphrates, and suppose that those of your own nation that dwell in Adiabene will come to your assistance; but certainly these will not embarrass themselves with an unjustifiable war, nor, if they should follow such ill advice, will the Parthians permit them to do so. For it is their concern to maintain the truce that is between them and the Romans, and they will be supposed to break the covenants between them, if any under their government march against the Romans. What remains therefore is this, that you have recourse to divine assistance; but this is already on the side of the Romans, for it is impossible that so vast an empire should be settled without God's providence. Reflect upon it, how impossible it is for your zealous observations of your religious customs to be here preserved, which are hard to be observed even when you fight with those whom you are able to conquer; and how can you then most of all hope for God's assistance, when, by being forced to transgress his law, you will make him turn his face from you? And if you do observe the custom of the Sabbath days, and will not be revealed on to do any thing thereon, you will easily be taken, as were your forefathers by Pompey, who was the busiest in his siege on those days in which the besieged rested. But if in time of war you transgress the law of your country, I cannot tell on whose account you will afterward go to war; for your concern is but one, that you do nothing against any of your forefathers. And how will you call upon God to assist you, when you are voluntarily transgressing against his religion? Now all men that go to war do it either as depending on divine or on human assistance; but since your going to war will cut off both these assistances, those that are for going to war choose evident destruction. What hinders you from slaying your children and wives with your own hands, and burning this most excellent native city of yours? For by this mad prank you will, however, escape the reproach of being beaten. But it were best, O my friends, it were best, while the vessel is still in the haven, to foresee the impending storm, and not to set sail out of the port into the middle of the hurricanes; for we justly pity those who fall into great misfortunes without foreseeing them; but for him who rushes into manifest ruin, he gains reproaches instead of commiseration. But certainly no one can imagine that you can enter into a war as by agreement, or that when the Romans have got you under their power, they will use you with moderation, or will not rather, for an example to other nations, burn your holy city, and utterly destroy your whole nation. For those of you who shall survive the war will not be able to find a place whither to flee, since all men have the Romans for their lords already, or are afraid they shall have hereafter. Nay, indeed, the danger concerns not those Jews that dwell here only, but those of them which dwell in other cities also; for there is no people upon the habitable earth which have not some portion of you among them, whom your enemies will slay in case you go to war, and on that account also; And so every city which hath Jews in it will be filled with slaughter for the sake of a few men, and they who slay them will be pardoned. But if that slaughter be not made by them, consider how wicked a thing it is to take arms against those that are so kind to you. Have pity, therefore, if not on your children and wives, yet upon this your metropolis, and its sacred walls. Spare the temple, and preserve the holy house, with its holy furniture, for yourselves. For if the Romans get you under their power, they will no longer abstain from them, when their former abstinence shall have been so ungratefully requited. I call to witness your sanctuary, and the holy angels of God, and this country common to us all, that I have not kept back anything that is for your preservation. And if you will follow that advice which you ought to do, you will have that peace which will be common to you and to me. But if you indulge your passions, you will run those hazards which I shall be free from. 5. When Agrippa had spoken thus, both he and his sister wept, and by their tears repressed a great deal of the violence of the people. But still they cried out, that they would not fight against the Romans, but against Florus, on account of what they had suffered by his means. To which Agrippa replied, that what they had already done was like such as make war against the Romans. For you have not paid the tribute which is due to Caesar. [Footnote: Julius Caesar had decreed that the Jews of Jerusalem should pay an annual tribute to the Romans, excepting the city Joppa, and for the sabbatical year.] And you have cut off the cloisters of the temple from joining to the tower Antonia. You will therefore prevent any occasion of revolt if you will but join these together again, and if you will but pay your tribute; for the citadel does not now belong to Florus, nor are you to pay the tribute money to Florus. End of Book 2, Chapter 16. Book 2, Chapter 17 of the Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wars of the Jews by Josephus. Translated by William Whitson. Book 2, Chapter 17. How the War of the Jews with the Romans began, and concerning Manahem. 1. This advice the people hearkened to, and went up into the temple with the king and Bernice, and began to rebuild the cloisters. The rulers also and senators divided themselves into the villages, and collected the tributes, and soon got together 40 talents, which was the sum that was deficient. And thus did Agrippa then put a stop to that war which was threatened. Moreover, he attempted to persuade the multitude to obey Florus, until Caesar should send one to succeed him. But they were hereby more provoked, and cast reproaches upon the king, and got him excluded out of the city. Nay, some of the seditious had the impudence to throw stones at him. So when the king saw that the violence of those that were for innovations was not to be restrained, and being very angry at the contumelies he had received, he sent their rulers, together with their men of power, to Florus, to Caesarea, that he might appoint whom he thought fit to collect the tribute in the country, while he retired to his own kingdom. 2. And at this time it was that some of those that principally excited the people to go to war made an assault upon a certain fortress called Masada. They took it by treachery, and slew the Romans that were there, and put others of their own party to keep it. At the same time Eleazar, the son of Ananias the high priest, a very bold youth, who was at that time the governor of the temple, persuaded those that officiated in the divine service to receive no gift or sacrifice for any foreigner. And this was the true beginning of our war with the Romans, for they rejected the sacrifice of Caesar on this account; and when many of the high priests and principal men besought them not to omit the sacrifice, which it was customary for them to offer for their princes, they would not be prevailed upon. These relied much upon their multitude, for the most flourishing part of the innovators assisted them; but they had the chief regard to Eleazar, the governor of the temple. 3. Hereupon the men of power got together, and conferred with the high priests, as did also the principal of the Pharisees, and thinking all was at stake, and that their calamities were becoming incurable, took counsel what was to be done. Accordingly, they determined to try what they could do with the seditious by words, and assembled the people before the brazen gate, which was that gate of the inner temple, court of the priests, which looked toward the sun rising. And, in the first place, they showed the great indignation they had at this attempt for a revolt, and for their bringing so great a war upon their country. After which they confuted their pretense as unjustifiable, and told them that their forefathers had adorned their temple in great part with donations bestowed on them by foreigners, and had always received what had been presented to them from foreign nations; and that they had been so far from rejecting any person's sacrifice, which would be the highest instance of impiety, that they had themselves placed those donations about the temple which were still visible, and had remained there so long a time; that they did now irritate the Romans to take arms against them, and invited them to make war upon them, and brought up novel rules of a strange divine worship, and determined to run the hazard of having their city condemned for impiety, while they would not allow any foreigner, but Jews only, either to sacrifice or to worship therein. And if such a law should be introduced in the case of a single private person only, he would have indignation at it, as an instance of inhumanity determined against him, while they have no regard to the Romans or to Caesar, and forbid even their oblations to be received also; that however they cannot but fear, lest, by thus rejecting their sacrifices, they shall not be allowed to offer their own; and that this city will lose its principality, unless they grow wiser quickly, and restore the sacrifices as formerly, and indeed amend the injury they have offered foreigners, before the report of it comes to the ears of those that have been injured. 4. And as they said these things, they produced those priests that were skillful in the customs of their country, who made the report that all their forefathers had received the sacrifices from foreign nations; but still not one of the innovators would hearken to what was said; nay, those that ministered about the temple would not attend their divine service, but were preparing matters for beginning the war. So the men of power perceiving that the sedition was too hard for them to subdue, and that the danger which would arise from the Romans would come upon them first of all, endeavored to save themselves, and sent ambassadors, some to Florus, the chief of which was Simon the son of Ananias, and others to Agrippa, among whom the most eminent were Saul, and Antipas, and Christobarus, who were of the king's kindred; and they desired of them both that they should come with an army to the city, and cut off the seditious before it should be too hard to be subdued. Now this terrible message was good news to Florus; and because his design was to have a war kindled, he gave the ambassadors no answer at all. But Agrippa was equally solicitous for those that were revolting, and for those against whom the war was to be made, and was desirous to preserve the Jews for the Romans, and the temple and metropolis for the Jews. He was also sensible that it was not for his own advantage that the disturbances should proceed; so he sent 3,000 horsemen to the assistance of the people out of Auranitis, and Batanea, and Trachonitis, and these under Darius, the master of his horse, and Philip the son of Jacomus, the general of his army. 5. Upon this the men of power, with the high priests, as also all the part of the multitude that were desirous of peace, took courage, and seized upon the upper city, Mount Sion; for the seditious part had the lower city and the temple in their power; so they made use of stones and slings perpetually against one another, and threw darts continually on both sides; and sometimes it happened that they made incursions by troops, and fought it out hand to hand, while the seditious were superior in boldness, but the king's soldiers in skill. These last strove chiefly to gain the temple, and to drive those out of it who profaned it; as did the seditious, with Eleazar, besides what they had already, labor to gain the upper city. Thus there were perpetual slaughters on both sides for 7 days' time, but neither side would yield up the parts they had seized on. 6. Now the next day was the festival of Xylophory, upon which the custom was for every one to bring wood for the altar, that there might never be a want of fuel for that fire which was unquenchable and always burning. Upon that day they excluded the opposite party from the observation of this part of religion; and when they had joined to themselves many of the Sicarii, who crowded in among the weaker people, that was the name for such robbers as had under their bosoms swords called sicae, they grew bolder, and carried their undertaking further; insomuch that the king's soldiers were overpowered by their multitude and boldness; and so they gave way, and were driven out of the upper city by force. The others then set fire to the house of Ananias the high priest, and to the palaces of Agrippa and Bernice; after which they carried the fire to the place where the archives were reposited, and made haste to burn the contracts belonging to their creditors, and thereby to dissolve their obligations for paying their debts; and this was done in order to gain the multitude of those who had been debtors, and that they might persuade the poorer sort to join in their insurrection with safety against the more wealthy. So the keepers of the records fled away, and the rest set fire to them. And when they had thus burnt down the nerves of the city, they fell upon their enemies; at which time some of the men of power, and of the high priests, went into the vaults under ground, and concealed themselves, while others fled with the king's soldiers to the upper palace, and shut the gates immediately; among whom were Ananias the high priest, and the ambassadors that had been sent to Agrippa. And now the seditious were contented with the victory they had gotten, and the buildings they had burnt down, and proceeded no further. 7. But on the next day, which was the 15th of the month Los [Ab], they made an assault upon Antonia, and besieged the garrison which was in it 2 days, and then took the garrison, and slew them, and set the citadel on fire; after which they marched to the palace, whither the king's soldiers were fled, and parted themselves into 4 bodies, and made an attack upon the walls. As for those that were within it, no one had the courage to sally out, because those that assaulted them were so numerous; but they distributed themselves into the breastworks and turrets, and shot at the besiegers, whereby many of the robbers fell under the walls; nor did they cease to fight one with another, either by night or by day, while the seditious supposed that those within would grow weary for want of food, and those without supposed the others would do the like by the tediousness of the siege. 8. In the meantime, one Manahem, the son of Judas, that was called the Galilean, who was a very cunning sophister, and had formerly reproached the Jews under Cyrenius, that after God they were subject to the Romans, took some of the men of note with him, and retired to Masada, where he broke open king Herod's armory, and gave arms not only to his own people, but to other robbers also. These he made use of for a guard, and returned in the state of a king to Jerusalem. He became the leader of a sedition, and gave orders for continuing the siege; but they wanted proper instruments, and it was not practicable to undermine the wall, because the darts came down upon them from above. But still they dug a mine from a great distance under one of the towers, and made it totter, and having done that, they set on fire what was combustible, and left it; and when the foundations were burnt below, the tower fell down suddenly. Yet did they then meet with another wall that had been built within, for the besieged were sensible beforehand of what they were doing, and probably the tower shook as it was undermining. So they provided themselves of another fortification, which when the besiegers unexpectedly saw, while they thought they had already gained the place, they were under some consternation. However, those that were within sent to Manahem, and to the other leaders of the sedition, and desired they might go out upon a capitulation. This was granted to the king's soldiers and their own countrymen only, who went out accordingly; but the Romans that were left alone were greatly dejected, for they were not able to force their way through such a multitude; and to desire them to give them their right hand for their security, they thought it would be a reproach to them; and besides, if they should give it them, they durst not depend upon it. So they deserted their camp, as easily taken, and ran away to the royal towers, that called Hippicus, that called Phasaelis, and that called Mariamne. But Manahem and his party fell upon the place whence the soldiers were fled, and slew as many of them as they could catch before they got up to the towers, and plundered what they had left behind them, and set fire to their camp. This was executed on the 6th day of the month Gorpius [Elul]. 9. But on the next day the high priest was caught where he had concealed himself in an aqueduct; he was slain, together with Hezekiah his brother, by the robbers. Hereupon the seditious besieged the towers, and kept them guarded, lest any one of the soldiers should escape. Now the overthrow of the places of strength, and the death of the high priest Ananias, so puffed up Manahem, that he became barbarously cruel; and as he thought he had no antagonist to dispute the management of affairs with him, he was no better than an insupportable tyrant. But Eleazar and his party, when words had passed between them, how it was not proper when they revolted from the Romans, out of the desire of liberty, to betray that liberty to any of their own people, and to bear a lord who, though he should be guilty of no violence, was yet meaner than themselves; as also, that in case they were obliged to set some one over their public affairs, it was fitter they should give that privilege to any one rather than to him. They made an assault upon him in the temple, for he went up thither to worship in a pompous manner, and adorned with royal garments, and had his followers with him in their armor. But Eleazar and his party fell violently upon him, as did also the rest of the people. and taking up stones to attack him withal, they threw them at the sophister, and thought, that if he were once ruined, the entire sedition would fall to the ground. Now Manahem and his party made resistance for a while; but when they perceived that the whole multitude were falling upon them, they fled which way every one was able; those that were caught were slain, and those that hid themselves were searched for. A few there were of them who privately escaped to Masada, among whom was Eleazar, the son of Jairus, who was of kin to Manahem, and acted the part of a tyrant at Masada afterward. As for Manahem himself, he ran away to a place called Ophla, and there lay skulking in private. But they took him alive, and drew him out before them all. They then tortured him with many sorts of torments, and after all slew him, as they did by those that were captains under him also, and particularly by the principal instrument of his tyranny, whose name was Absalom. 10. And, as I said, so far truly the people assisted them, while they hoped this might afford some amendment to the seditious practices. But the others were not in haste to put an end to the war, but hoped to prosecute it with less danger, now they had slain Manahem. It is true that when the people earnestly desired that they would leave off besieging the soldiers, they were the more earnest in pressing it forward, and this till Metilius, who was the Roman general, sent to Eleazar, and desired that they would give him security to spare their lives only, but agreed to deliver up their arms, and what else they had with them. The others readily complied with their petition, sent to them Gorion, the son of Nicodemus, and Ananias, the son of Sadok, and Judas, the son of Jonathan, that they might give them the security of their right hands and of their oaths. After which Melitius brought down his soldiers, which soldiers, while they were in arms, were not meddled with by any of the seditious, nor was there any appearance of treachery; but as soon as, according to the articles of capitulation, they had all laid down their shields and their swords, and were under no further suspicion of any harm, but were going away, Eleazar's men attacked them after a violent manner, and encompassed them around, and slew them, while they neither defended themselves nor entreated for mercy, but only cried out upon the breach of their articles of capitulation and their oaths. And thus were all these men barbarously murdered, excepting Metilius; for when he entreated for mercy, and promised that he would turn Jew, and be circumcised, they saved him alive, but none else. This loss to the Romans was but light, there being no more than a few slain out of an immense army; but still it appeared to be a prelude to the Jews' own destruction, while men made public lamentation when they saw that such occasions were afforded for a war as were incurable; that the city was all over polluted with such abominations, from which it was but reasonable to expect some vengeance, even though they should escape revenge from the Romans; so that the city was filled with sadness, and every one of the moderate men in it were under great disturbance, as likely themselves to undergo punishment for the wickedness of the seditious; for indeed it so happened that this murder was perpetrated on the Sabbath day, on which day the Jews have a respite from their works on account of divine worship. End of Book 2, Chapter 17.
Book 2, Chapter 18 of the Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Doug Delisle. The Wars of the Jews by Josephus. Translated by William Whiston. Book 2, Chapter 18. The Calamities and Slaughters that Came upon the Jews. 1. Now the people of Caesarea had slain the Jews that were among them, on the very same day and hour when the soldiers were slain, which one would think must have come to pass by the direction of Providence, insomuch that in 1 hour's time above 20,000 Jews were killed, and all Caesarea was emptied of its Jewish inhabitants. For Florus caught such as ran away, and sent them in bonds to the galleys. Upon which stroke that the Jews received at Caesarea, the whole nation was greatly enraged. So they divided themselves into several parties, and laid waste to the villages of the Syrians, and their neighboring cities, Philadelphia, and Sebonitis, and Gerasa, and Pella, and Scythopolis, and after them Gadara and Hippos. And falling upon Gaulonitis, some cities they destroyed there, and some they set on fire, and then went to Kedasa, belonging to the Tyrians, and to Ptolemais, and to Gaba, and to Caesarea. nor was either Sebaste or Ascalon able to oppose the violence with which they were attacked. And when they had burnt these to the ground, they entirely demolished Anthedon and Gaza. Many also of the villages that were about every one of those cities were plundered, and an immense slaughter was made of the men who were caught in them. 2. However, the Syrians were even with the Jews in the multitude of the men whom they slew, for they killed those whom they caught in their cities, and that not only out of the hatred they bare them, as formerly, but to prevent the danger under which they were from them, so that the disorders in all Syria were terrible, and every city was divided into 2 armies, encamped one against the other, and the preservation of the one party was in the destruction of the other. So the daytime was spent in shedding of blood, and the night in fear, which was of the 2 the more terrible. For when the Syrians thought they had ruined the Jews, they had the Judaizers in suspicion also. And as each side did not care to slay those whom they only suspected on the other, so did they greatly fear them when they were mingled with the other, as if they were certainly foreigners. Moreover, greediness of gain was a provocation to kill the opposite party, even to such as had of old appeared very mild and gentle towards them, for they without fear plundered the effects of the slain, and carried off the spoils of those whom they slew to their own houses, as if they had been gained in a set battle. And he was esteemed a man of honor who got the greatest share, as having prevailed over the greatest number of his enemies. It was then common to see cities filled with dead bodies, still laying unburied, and those of old men mixed with infants, all dead and scattered about together. Women also lay amongst them without any covering for their nakedness. You might then see the whole province full of inexpressible calamities, while the dread of still more barbarous practices, which were threatened, was everywhere greater than what had already been perpetrated. 3. And thus far the conflict had been between Jews and foreigners, but when they made excursions to Scythopolis, they found Jews that acted as enemies. For as they stood in battle array with those of Scythopolis, and preferred their own safety before their relation to us, they fought against their own countrymen. Nay, their alacrity was so very great that those of Scythopolis suspected them. These were afraid, therefore, lest they should make an assault upon the city in the night time, and, to their great misfortune, should thereby make an apology for themselves to their own people for the revolt from them. So they commanded them that in case they would confirm their agreement and demonstrate their fidelity to them, who were of a different nation, they should go out of the city with their families to a neighboring grove, and when they had done as they were commanded without suspecting anything, the people of Scythopolis lay still for the interval of 2 days to tempt them to be secure. But on the 3rd night they watched their opportunity and cut all their throats, some as they lay unguarded and some as they lay asleep. The number that was slain was above 13,000, and then they plundered them of all they had. 4. It will deserve our relation what befell Simon. He was the son of one Saul, a man of reputation among the Jews. This man was distinguished from the rest by the strength of his body and the boldness of his conduct, although he abused them both to the mischieving of his countrymen. For he came every day and slew a great many of the Jews of Scythopolis, and he frequently put them to flight, and became himself alone the cause of his army's conquering. But a just punishment overtook him for the murders he had committed upon those of the same nation with him. For when the people of Scythopolis threw their darts at them in the grove, he drew his sword, but he did not attack any of the enemy, for he saw that he could do nothing against such a multitude. But he cried out after a very moving manner, and said, O you people of Scythopolis, I deservedly suffer for what I have done with relation to you, when I gave you such security of my fidelity to you, by slaying so many of those that were related to me. Wherefore we very justly experienced the perfidiousness of foreigners, while we acted after a most wicked manner against our own nation. I will therefore die, polluted wretch as I am, by mine own hands, for it is not fit I should die by the hand of our enemies. And let the same action be to me both a punishment for my great crimes, and a testimony of my courage to my commendation, that so no one of our enemies may have it to brag of, that he it was that slew me, and no one may insult upon me as I fall. Now when he had said this, he looked round about him upon his family with eyes of commiseration and of rage. That family consisted of a wife and children and his aged parents. So in the first place he caught his father by his gray hairs, and ran his sword through him, and after him he did the same to his mother, who willingly received it. And after them he did the like to his wife and children, every one almost offering themselves to his sword, as desirous to prevent being slain by their enemies. So when he had gone over all his family, he stood upon their bodies to be seen by all, and stretching out his right hand, that his action might be observed by all, he sheathed his entire sword into his own bowels. This young man was to be pitied on account of the strength of his body and the courage of his soul, but since he had assured foreigners of his fidelity against his own countrymen, he suffered deservedly. 5. Besides this murder at Scythopolis, the other cities rose up against the Jews that were among them. Those of Ascalon slew 2,500, and those of Ptolemais 2,000, and put not a few into bonds. Those of Tyre also put a great number to death, but kept a greater number in prison. Moreover, those of Hippos and those of Gadara did the like, while they put to death the boldest of the Jews, but kept those of whom they were afraid in custody, as did the rest of the cities of Syria, according as they every one either hated them or were afraid of them. Only the Antiochtans and the Sidonians and Epamians spared those that dwelt with them, and would not endure either to kill any of the Jews or to put them in bonds. And because they spared them, because their own number was so great that they despised their attempts. But I think the greatest part of this favor was owing to their commiseration of those whom they saw to make no innovations. As for the Gerasenes, they did no harm to those that abode with them, and for those who had a mind to go away, they conducted them as far as their borders reached. 6. There was also a plot laid against the Jews in Agrippa's kingdom, for he was himself gone to Cestius Gallus, to Antioch, but had left one of his companions, whose name was Noarus, to take care of the public affairs, which Noarus was of kin to King Sohemus. Footnote. Of this Sohemus we have mention made by Tacitus. We also learn from Dio that his father was king of the Arabians of Iturea, which Iturea is mentioned by St. Luke chapter 3, verse 1, both whose testimonies are quoted here by Dr. Hudson. End of footnote. Now there came certain men, 70 in number, out of Batanea, who were the most considerable for their families and prudence for the rest of the people. These desired to have an army put into their hands, that if any tumult should happen, they might have about them a guard sufficient to restrain such as might rise up against them. This Noarus sent out some of the king's armed men by night, and slew all those 70 men, which bold action he ventured upon without the consent of Agrippa, and was such a lover of money that he chose to be so wicked to his own countrymen, though he brought ruin on the kingdom thereby. And thus cruelly did he treat the nation, and this contrary to the laws also, until Agrippa was informed of it, who did not indeed dare to put him to death out of regard to Sohemus, but still he put an end to his procuratorship immediately. But as to the seditious, they took the citadel which was called Cypros, which was above Jericho, and cut the throats of the garrison, and utterly demolished the poor fortifications. This was about the same time that the multitude of the Jews that were at Machaerus persuaded the Romans who were in garrison to leave the place and deliver it up to them. These Romans, being in great fear, lest the place should be taken by force, made an agreement with them to depart upon certain conditions. And when they had obtained the security they desired, they delivered up the citadel, into which the people of Machaerus put a garrison for their own security, and held it in their own power. 7. But for Alexandria, the sedition of the people of the place against the Jews was perpetual, and this from that very time when Alexander the Great, upon finding the readiness of the Jews in assisting him against the Egyptians, and as a reward for such their assistance, gave them equal privileges in this city with the Grecians themselves, which honorary reward continued among them under his successors, who also set apart for them a particular place, that they might live without being polluted by the Gentiles. and were therefore not so much intermixed with foreigners as before. They also gave them this further privilege, that they should be called Macedonians. Nay, when the Romans got possession of Egypt, neither the first Caesar, nor any one that came after him, thought of diminishing the honors which Alexander had bestowed on the Jews. But still conflicts perpetually arose with the Grecians, and although the governors did every day punish many of them, yet did the sedition grow worse. But at this time especially, when there were tumults in other places also, the disorders among them were put into a greater flame, for when the Alexandrians had once a public assembly to deliberate about an embassage they were sending to Nero, a great number of Jews came flocking to the theater. But when their adversaries saw them, they immediately cried out, and called them their enemies, and said they came as spies upon them, upon which they rushed out and laid violent hands upon them. And as for the rest, they were slain as they ran away, but there were 3 men whom they caught, and hauled them along in order to have them burnt alive. But all the Jews came in a body to defend them, who at first threw stones at the Grecians, but after that they took lamps, and rushed with violence into the theater, and threatened that they would burn the people to a man. And this they had soon done, unless Tiberius Alexander, the governor of the city, had restrained their passions. However, this man did not begin to teach them wisdom by arms, but sent among them privately some of the principal men, and thereby entreated them to be quiet, and not provoke the Roman army against them. But the seditious made a jest of the entreaties of Tiberius, and reproached him for so doing. 8. Now when he perceived that those who were for innovations would not be pacified till some great calamity should overtake them, he sent out upon them those 2 Roman legions that were in the city, and together with them 5,000 other soldiers, who by chance were come together out of Libya to the ruin of the Jews. They were also permitted not only to kill them, but to plunder them of what they had, and to set fire to their houses. These soldiers rushed violently into that part of the city that was called Delta, where the Jewish people lived together, and did as they were bidden, though not without bloodshed on their own side also. For the Jews got together, and set those that were the best armed among them in the forefront, and made a resistance for a great while. But when once they gave back, they were destroyed unmercifully, and this their destruction was complete, some being caught in the open field, and others forced into their houses, which houses were first plundered of what was in them, and then set on fire by the Romans, wherein no mercy was shown to the infants, and no regard had to the aged, but they went on into the slaughter of persons of every age, till all the place was overflowed with blood, and 50,000 of them lay dead upon heaps. Nor had the remainder been preserved, had they not betaken themselves to supplication. So Alexander commiserated their condition, and gave orders to the Romans to retire. Accordingly, these being accustomed to obey orders, left off killing at the first intimation. But the populace of Alexandria bare so very great hatred to the Jews, that it was difficult to recall them, and it was a hard thing to make them leave their dead bodies. 9. And this was the miserable calamity which at this time befell the Jews at Alexandria. Hereupon Cestius thought fit no longer to lie still, while the Jews were everywhere up in arms. So he took out of Antioch the 12th legion entire, and out of each of the rest he selected 2,000, with 6 cohorts of footmen, and 4 troops of horsemen, besides those auxiliaries which were sent by the kings. Of these Antiochus sent 2,000 horsemen, and 3,000 footmen, with as many archers. And Agrippa sent the same number of footmen, and 1,000 horsemen. Sohemus also followed with 4,000, a third part whereof were horsemen, but most part were archers. And thus did he march to Ptolemais. There was also great numbers of auxiliaries gathered together from the free cities, who indeed had not the same skill in martial affairs, but made up in their alacrity and in their hatred to the Jews what they wanted in skill. There came also along with Cestius Agrippa himself, both as a guide in his march over the country, and a director what was fit to be done. So Cestius took part of his forces, and marched hastily to Zabulon, a strong city of Galilee, which was called the City of Men, and divides the country of Ptolemaeus from our nation. This he found deserted by its men, the multitude having fled to the mountains, but full of all sorts of good things. Those he gave leave to the soldiers to plunder, and set fire to the city, although it was of admirable beauty, and had its houses built like those in Tyre, and Sidon, and Berytus. After this he overran all the country, and seized upon whatsoever came in his way, and set fire to the villages that were round about them, and then returned to Ptolemais. But when the Syrians, and especially those of Berytus, were busy in plundering, the Jews pulled up their courage again, for they knew that Cestius was retired, and fell upon those that were left behind unexpectedly, and destroyed about 2,000 of them. Footnote. Spanheim notes on the place that this later Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes, is mentioned by Dio, and that he is mentioned by Josephus elsewhere twice also. End footnote. 10. And now Cestius himself marched from Ptolemais, and came to Caesarea, but he sent part of his army before him to Joppa, and gave order that if they could take that city by surprise, they should keep it, but that in case the citizens should perceive they were coming to attack them, that they should stay for him and for the rest of the army. But that in case the citizens should perceive they were coming to attack them, that they then should stay for him and for the rest of the army. So some of them made a brisk march by the seaside, and some by land, and so coming upon them on both sides, they took the city with ease. And as the inhabitants had made no provisions beforehand for a fight, nor had gotten anything ready for fighting, the soldiers fell upon them and slew them all with their families, and then plundered and burnt the city. The number of the slain was 8,400. In like manner, Cestius sent also a considerable body of horsemen to the toparchy of Narbertine, that adjoined to Caesarea, who destroyed the country, and slew a great multitude of its people. They also plundered what they had and burnt their villages. But Cestius sent Gallus, the commander of the 12th legion, into Galilee, and delivered to him as many of his forces as he supposed sufficient to subdue that nation. He was received by the strongest city of Galilee, which was Sepphoris, with acclamations of joy, which wise conduct of that city occasioned the rest of the cities to be in quiet, while the seditious part and the robbers ran away to that mountain which lies in the very middle of Galilee, and is situated over against Sepphoris. It is called Azaman. So Gallus brought his forces against them. But while those men were in the superior parts above the Romans, they easily threw their darts upon the Romans as they made their approaches, and slew about 200 of them. But when the Romans had gone round the mountains, and were gotten into the parts above their enemies, the others were soon beaten, nor could they who had only light armor on sustain the force of them that fought them armed all over, nor when they were beaten could they escape the enemy's horsemen, insomuch that only some few concealed themselves in certain places hard to come at among the mountains, while the rest, above 2,000 in number, were slain. End of Book 2, Chapter 18. Recording by Doug Delisle. Book 2, Chapter 19 of the Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Doug Delisle. The Wars of the Jews by Josephus, translated by William Whiston, Book 2, Chapter 19. What Cestius did against the Jews, and how, upon his besieging Jerusalem, he retreated from the city without any just occasion in the world, as also what severe calamities he underwent from the Jews in his retreat. 1. And now Gallus, seeing nothing more that looked towards an innovation in Galilee, returned with his army to Caesarea. But Cestius removed with his whole army, and marched to Antipatris. And when he was informed that there was a great body of Jewish forces gotten together in a certain tower called Aphek, he sent a party before to fight them. But this party dispersed the Jews by affrighting them before it came to a battle. So they came, and finding their camp deserted, they burnt it, as well as the villages that lay about it. But when Cestius had marched from Antipatris to Lydda, he found the city empty of its men, for the whole multitude were gone up to Jerusalem to the Feast of Tabernacles. Footnote: here we have an eminent example of that Jewish language which Dr. Whale truly observes, we several times find used in the sacred writings. I mean, where the words all or whole multitude, etc., are used for much the greatest part only, but not so as to include every person without exception. For when Josephus had said that the whole multitude, all the males of Lydda, were gone to the Feast of Tabernacles, he immediately adds that, however, no fewer than 50 of them appeared, and were slain by the Romans. Other examples somewhat like this I have observed elsewhere in Josephus, but, as I think, none so remarkable as this. End footnote. Yet did he destroy 50 of those that showed themselves, and burnt the city, and so marched forwards. And descending by Betboron, he pitched his camp at a certain place called Gibeah, 50 furlongs distant from Jerusalem. 2. But as for the Jews, when they saw the war approaching to their metropolis, they left the feast, and betook themselves to their arms, and taking courage greatly from their multitude, went in a sudden and disorderly manner to the fight, with a great noise, and without any consideration had of the rest of the 7th day, although the Sabbath was the day in which they had the greatest regard. Footnote: we have also, in this and the next section, 2 eminent facts to be observed, namely, the first example that I remember in Josephus of the onset of the Jews' enemies upon their country when their males were gone up to Jerusalem to one of their 3 sacred festivals, which during the theocracy God had promised to preserve them from. Exodus chapter 34, verse 24. The second fact is this: the breach of the Sabbath by the seditious Jews in an offensive fight, contrary to the universal doctrine and practice of their nation in these ages, and even contrary to what they themselves afterward practiced in the rest of this war. End footnote. But that rage which made them forget the religious observation of the Sabbath made them too hard for their enemies in the fight. With such violence, therefore, did they fall upon the Romans, as to break into their ranks, and to march through the midst of them, making a great slaughter as they went, insomuch that unless the horsemen and such part of the footmen as were not yet tired in the action had wheeled round, and succored that part of the army which was not yet broken, Cestius with his whole army had been in danger. However, 515 of the Romans were slain, of which number 400 were footmen, and the rest horsemen, while the Jews lost only 22, of whom the most valiant were the kinsmen of Monobazus, king of Adiabene, and their names were Monobazus and Kenedius, and next to them were Niger of Perea and Silas of Babylon, who had deserted from King Agrippa to the Jews, for he had formerly served in the army. When the front of the Jewish army had been cut off, the Jews retired into the city, but still Simon, the son of Giora, fell upon the backs of the Romans as they were sending up Bethoron, and put the hindmost of the army into disorder, and carried off many of the beasts that carted the weapons of war, and led Shem into the city. But as Cestius tarried there 3 days, the Jews seized upon the elevated parts of the city, and set watches at the entrances into the city, and appeared openly resolved not to rest when once the Romans should begin to march. 3. And now when Agrippa observed that even the affairs of the Romans were likely to be in danger, while such an immense multitude of their enemies had seized upon the mountains round about, he determined to try what the Jews would agree to by words, as thinking that he should either persuade them all to desist from fighting, or, however, that he should cause the sober part of them to separate themselves from the opposite party. So he sent Borsius and Phoebus, the members of his party that were the best known to them, and promised them that Cestius should give them his right hand to secure them of the Romans' entire forgiveness of what they had done amiss, if they should throw away their arms and come over to them. But the seditious, fearing lest the whole multitude, in hopes of security to themselves, should go over to Agrippa, resolved immediately to fall upon and kill the ambassadors. Accordingly, they slew Phoebus before he said a word, but Borsius was only wounded, and so prevented his fate by flying away. And when the people were very angry at this, they had the seditious beaten with stones and clubs, and drove them before them into the city. 4. But now Cestius, observing that the disturbances that were begun among the Jews afforded him a proper opportunity to attack them, took his whole army along with him and put the Jews to flight, and pursued them to Jerusalem. He then pitched his camp upon the elevation called Scopus, or Watchtower, which was distant 7 furlongs from the city. Yet did he not assault them in 3 days' time, out of expectation that those within might perhaps yield a little. And in the meantime he sent a great many of his soldiers into neighboring villages to seize upon their corn. And on the 4th day, which was the 30th of the month Hyperboretus, when he had put his army in array, he brought it into the city. Now for the people they were kept under by the seditious, but the seditious themselves were greatly affrighted at the good order of the Romans, and retired from the suburbs, and retreated into the inner part of the city, and into the temple. But when Cestius was come into the city, he set the part called Bezetha, which is also called Sinopolis, or the new city, on fire, as he did also to the timber market. After which he came into the upper city, and pitched his camp over against the royal palace. And had he but at this very time attempted to get within the walls by force, he had won the city presently, and the war had been put an end to at once. But Tyrannus Praesius, the muster-master of the army, and a great number of the officers of the horse, had been corrupted by Florus, and diverted from that his attempt, and that was the occasion that this war lasted so very long, and thereby the Jews were involved in such incurable calamities. 5. In the meantime, many of the principal men of the city were persuaded by Ananus, the son of Jonathan, and invited Cestius into the city, and were about to open the gates for him. But he overlooked this offer, partly out of his anger at the Jews, and partly because he did not thoroughly believe they were in earnest. Whence it was that he delayed the matter so long, that the seditious perceived the treachery, and threw Ananus and those of his party down from the wall, and pelting them with stones drove them into their houses. But they stood themselves at proper distances in the towers, and threw their darts at those that were getting over the wall. Thus did the Romans make their attack against the wall for 5 days, but to no purpose. But on the next day Cestius took a great many of his choicest men, and with them the archers, and attempted to break into the temple at the northern quarter of it. But the Jews beat them off from the cloisters, and repulsed them several times when they were gotten near to the wall, till at length the multitude of the darts cut them off, and made them retire. But the first rank of the Romans rested their shields upon the wall, and so did those that were behind them, and the like did those that were still more backward, and guarded themselves with what they call testudo, the backside of a tortoise, upon which the darts that were thrown fell and slid off without doing them any harm, without being themselves hurt, and got all things ready for setting fire to the gate of the temple. 6. And now it was that a horrible fear seized upon the seditious, insomuch that many of them ran out of the city, as though it were to be taken immediately. But the people upon this took courage, and where the wicked part of the city gave ground, thither did they come, in order to set open the gates, and to admit Cestius as their benefactor, who, had he but continued the siege a little longer, had certainly taken the city. But it was, I suppose, owing to the aversion God had already at the city and the sanctuary, that he was hindered from putting an end to the war that very day. Footnote: there may be another very important and very providential reason be here assigned for this strange and foolish retreat of Cestius, which, if Josephus had been now a Christian, he might probably have taken notice of also, and that is, the affording the Jewish Christians in the city an opportunity of calling to mind the prediction and caution given them by Christ about 33 and a half years before, that when they should see the abomination of desolation, the idolatrous Roman armies with the images of their idols in their ensigns ready to lay Jerusalem desolate, stand where it ought not, or in the holy place, or when they should see Jerusalem any one instance of a more unpolitic but more providential compassed with armies, they should then flee to the mount conduct than this retreat of Cestius visible during this whole reigns, by complying with which those Jewish Christians fled the siege of Jerusalem, which yet was providentially such a great to the mountains of Perea, and escaped this destruction. See, tribulation had not been from the beginning of the world to that time. No, nor was there perhaps, nor should ever be. End footnote. 7. It then happened that Cestius was not conscious either how the besieged despaired of success, nor how courageous the people were for him. And so he recalled his soldiers from the place, and by despairing of any expectation of taking it, without having received any disgrace, he retired from the city without any reason in the world. But when the robbers perceived this unexpected retreat of his, they resumed their courage, and ran after the hinder parts of the army, and destroyed a considerable number of both their horsemen and footmen. And now Cestius lay all night at the camp which was at Scopus, and as he went off farther next day, he thereby invited the enemy to follow him, who still fell upon the hindmost, and destroyed them. They also fell upon the flank on each side of the army, and threw darts upon them obliquely, nor durst those that were hindmost turn back upon those who wounded them behind, as imagining that the multitude of those that pursued them was immense. Nor did they venture to drive away those that pressed upon them on each side, because they were heavy with their arms, and were afraid of breaking their ranks to pieces, and because they saw the Jews were light and ready for making incursions upon them. And this was the reason why the Romans suffered greatly, without being able to revenge themselves upon their enemies. So they were galled all the way, and their ranks were put into disorder, and those that were thus put out of their ranks were slain, among whom were Priscus, the commander of the 6th legion, and Longinus, the tribune, and Aemilius Secundus, the commander of a troop of horsemen. So it was not without difficulty that they got to Gabeo, their former camp, and that not without the loss of a great part of their baggage. There it was that Cestius stayed 2 days, and was in great distress to know what he should do in these circumstances. But when on the 3rd day he saw a still much greater number of enemies, and all the parts round about him full of Jews, he understood that his delay was to his own detriment, and that if he stayed any longer there, he should have still more enemies upon him. 8. That therefore he might fly the faster, he gave orders to cast away what might hinder his army's march. So they killed the mules and other creatures, excepting those that carried their darts and machines, which they retained for their own use, and this principally because they were afraid lest the Jews should seize upon them. He then made his army march on as far as Bethoron. Now the Jews did not so much press upon them when they were in large open places, but when they were penned up in their descent through narrow passages, then did some of them get before, and hindered them from getting out of them. And others of them thrust the hindermost down into the lower places, and the whole multitude extended themselves over against the neck of the passage, and covered the Roman army with their darts. In which circumstances, as the footmen knew not how to defend themselves, so the danger pressed the horsemen still more, for they were so pelted that they could not march along the roads in their ranks, and the ascents were so high that the cavalry were not able to march against the enemy. The precipices also, and valleys into which they frequently fell and tumbled down, were such on each side of them, that there was neither place for their flight, nor any contrivance could be thought of for their defense, till the distress they were at last in was so great, that they betook themselves to lamentations, and to such mournful cries as men use in the utmost despair. The joyful acclamations of the Jews also, as they encouraged one another, echoed the sounds back again, these last composing a noise of those that at once rejoiced and were in a rage. Indeed, things were come to such a pass that the Jews had almost taken Cestius's entire army prisoners, had not the night come on, when the Romans fled to Bethoron, and the Jews seized upon all the places round about them, and watched for their coming out in the morning. 9. And then it was that Cestius, despairing of obtaining room for a public march, contrived how he might best run away. And when he had selected 400 of the most courageous of his soldiers, he placed them at the strongest of their fortifications, and gave order that when they went up to the morning guard, they should erect their ensigns, that the Jews might be made to believe that the entire army was still there, while he himself took the rest of his forces with him, and marched, without any noise, 30 furlongs. But when the Jews perceived in the morning that the camp was empty, they ran upon those 400 who had deluded them, and immediately threw their darts at them and slew them, and then pursued after Cestius. But he had already made use of a great part of the night in his flight, and still marched quicker when it was day, insomuch that the soldiers, through the astonishment and fear that they were in, left behind their engines for sieges, and for throwing of stones, and a great part of the instruments of war. So the Jews went on pursuing the Romans as far as Antipatris, after which, seeing they could not overtake them, they came back, and took the engines, and spoiled the dead bodies, and gathered the prey together which the Romans had left behind them, and came back running and singing to their metropolis, while they had themselves lost a few only, but had slain of the Romans 5,300 footmen and 380 horsemen. This defeat happened on the 8th day of the month Dias, in the 12th year of the reign of Nero. End of Book 2, Chapter 19. Recording by Doug Delisle.
Book 2, Chapter 20, of the Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wars of the Jews by Josephus. Translated by William Whiston. Book 2, Chapter 20. Cestius sends ambassadors to Nero. The people of Damascus slayed those Jews that lived with them. The people of Jerusalem, after they had left off pursuing Cestius, returned to the city and get things ready for its defense, and make a great many generals for their armies, and particularly Josephus, the writer of these books, some account of his administration. After this calamity had befallen Cestius, many of the most eminent of the Jews swam away from the city, as from a ship when it was going to sink. Costobarus, therefore, and Saul, who were brethren, together with Philip, the son of Jachimus, who was the commander of King Agrippa's forces, ran away from the city, and went to Cestius. But then how Antipas, who had been besieged with them in the king's palace, but would not fly away with them, was afterward slain by the seditious, we shall relate hereafter. However, Cestius sent Saul and his friends, at their own desire, to Achaia, to Nero, to inform him of the great distress they were in, and to lay the blame of their kindling the war upon Florus, as hoping to alleviate his own danger, by provoking his indignation against Florus. In the meantime, the people of Damascus, when they were informed of the destruction of the Romans, set about the slaughter of those Jews that were among them; and as they had them already cooped up together in the place of public exercises, which they had done out of the suspicion they had of them, they thought they should meet with no difficulty in the attempt. Yet did they distrust their own wives, which were almost all of them addicted to the Jewish religion, on which account it was that their greatest concern was how they might conceal these things from them. So they came upon the Jews, and cut their throats, as being in a narrow place, in number 10,000, and all of them unarmed, and this in 1 hour's time, without anybody to disturb them. But as to those who had pursued after Cestius, when they were returned back to Jerusalem, they overbore some of those that favored the Romans by violence, and some them persuaded, by entreaties, to join with them, and got together in great numbers in the temple, and appointed a great many generals for the war. Joseph also, the son of Gorion, [Footnote: From this name of Joseph, the son of Gorion, or Gorion the son of Joseph, one of the governors of Jerusalem, who was slain at the beginning of the tumults by the Zealots. The much later Jewish author of a history of that nation takes his title, and yet personates our true Josephus, the son of Matthias, but the cheat is too gross to be put upon the learned world. End of the footnote. And Ananus the high priest were chosen as governors of all affairs within the city, and with a particular charge to repair the walls of the city, for they did not ordain Eleazar, the son of Simon, to that office, although he had gotten into his possession the prey they had taken from the Romans, and the money they had taken from Cestius, together with a great part of the public treasures, because they saw he was of a tyrannical temper, and that his followers were, in their behaviour, like guards about him. However, the want they were in of Eleazar's money, and the subtle tricks used by him, brought also about that the people were circumvented, and submitted themselves to his authority in all public affairs. They also chose other generals from Idumea, Jesus the son of Saphias, one of the high priests, and Eleazar the son of Ananias the high priest. They also enjoined Niger, the then governor of Idumea, who was of a family that belonged to Perea beyond Jordan, and was thence called the Perite, that he should be obedient to those forenamed commanders. [Footnote: We may observe here that the Idumeans, as having been proselytes of justice since the days of John Hyrcanus, during about 195 years, were now esteemed as part of the Jewish nation, and these provided of a Jewish commander accordingly. Nor did they neglect the care of other parts of the country, but Joseph, the son of Simon, was sent as general to Jericho, as was Manasseh to Perea, and John the Essecu to the toparchy of Thamah. Luda was also added to his portion, and Joppa and Emmaus. But John, the son of Matthias, was made governor of the toparchies of Gopchnitica and Acrabattini, as was Josephus, the son of Matthias, of both the Galilees. Gamala also, which was the strongest city in those parts, was put under his command. So every one of the other commanders administered the affairs of his portion with that alacrity and prudence they were masters of. But as to Josephus, when he came into Galilee, his first care was to gain the good will of the people of that country, as sensible that he should thereby have in general good success, although he should fail in other points. And being conscious to himself that if he communicated part of his power to the great men, he should make them his fast friends, and that he should gain the same favour from the multitude, if he executed his commands by persons of their own country, and with whom they were well acquainted, he chose out 70 of the most prudent men, and those elders in age, and appointed them to be rulers of all Galilee, as he chose 7 judges in every city, to hear the lesser quarrels. For as to the greater causes, and those wherein life and death were concerned, he enjoined they should be brought to him and the 70 elders. [Footnote: We see here, and in Josephus' account of his own life, how exactly he imitated his legislator Moses, or perhaps only obeyed what he took to be his perpetual law, in appointing 7 lesser judges for smaller causes, in particular cities, and perhaps for the first hearing of greater causes, with the liberty of an appeal to 71 supreme judges, especially in those causes where life and death were concerned. Moreover, we find that he imitated Moses as well as the Romans in the number and distribution of the subaltern officers of his army, as Exodus 18-25, Deuteronomy 1-15, and in his charge against the offences common among soldiers, as Deuteronomy 13-9. In all which he showed his great wisdom and piety, and skilful conduct in martial affairs. Yet may we discern in his very high character of Artanus the high priest, who seems to have been the same who condemned St. James, bishop of Jerusalem, to be stoned, under Albinus the procurator, that when he wrote these books of the war he was not so much as an Ebionite Christian, otherwise he would not have failed, according to his usual custom, to have reckoned this his barbarous murder as a just punishment upon him for that his cruelty to the chief, or rather only Christian bishop of the circumcision. Nor, had he been then a Christian, could he immediately have spoken so movingly of the causes of the destruction of Jerusalem, without one word of either the condemnation of James or crucifixion of Christ, as he did when he was become a Christian afterward. Joseph was also, when he had settled these rules for determining causes by the law, with regard to the people's dealings one with another, betook himself to make provisions for their safety against external violence. And as he knew the Romans would fall upon Galilee, he built walls in proper places about Jotapata, and Bersabee, and Salamis, and besides these about Capherecho, and Jaffa, and Sigo, and what they call Mount Tabor, and Tarihi, and Tiberias. Moreover, he built walls about the caves near the lake of Gennesar, which places lay in the lower Galilee. The same he did to the places of upper Galilee, as well as to the rock called the rock of the Achabari, and to Seph, and Jamnith, and Meroth, and in Golonitis he fortified Seleucia, and Sogane, and Gamala. But as to those of Sepphoris, they were the only people to whom he gave leave to build their own walls, and this because he perceived they were rich and wealthy, and ready to go to war, without standing in need of any injunctions for that purpose. The case was the same with Gischala, which had a wall built about it by John, the son of Levi himself, but with the consent of Josephus. But for the building of the rest of the fortresses, he laboured together with all the other builders, and was present to give all the necessary orders for that purpose. He also got together an army out of Galilee of more than 100,000 young men, all of which he armed with the old weapons which he had collected together and prepared for them. And when he had considered that the Roman power became invincible, chiefly by their readiness in obeying orders, and the constant exercise of their arms, he despaired of teaching these his men to use of their arms, which was to be obtained by experience. But observing that their readiness in obeying orders was owing to the multitude of their officers, he made his partitions in his army more after the Roman manner, and appointed a great many subalterns. He also distributed the soldiers into various classes, whom he put under captains of tens, and captains of hundreds, and then under captains of thousands; and besides these he had commanders of larger bodies of men. He also taught them to give the signals one to another, and to call and recall the soldiers by the trumpets, how to expand the wings of an army, and make them wheel about, and when one wing has had success, to turn again and assist those that were hard set, and to join in the defence of what had most suffered. He also continually instructed them ill what concerned the courage of the soul, and the hardiness of the body, and above all, he exercised them for war, by declaring to them distinctly the good order of the Romans, and that they were to fight with men who, both by the strength of their bodies and courage of their souls, had conquered in a manner the whole habitable earth. he told them that he should make trial of the good order they would observe in war, even before it came to any battle, in case they would abstain from the crimes they used to indulge themselves in, such as theft and robbery and rapine, and from defrauding their own countrymen, and never to esteem the harm done to those that were so near of kin to them to be any advantage for themselves. For that wars are then managed the best when the warriors preserve a good conscience, but that such as are ill men in private life will not only have those for enemies which attack them, but God himself also for their antagonist. And thus did he continue to admonish them. Now he chose for the war such an army as was sufficient, 60,000 footmen and 250 horsemen. [Footnote: I should think that an army of 60,000 footmen should require many more than 250 horsemen, and we find Josephus had more horsemen under his command than 250 in his future history. I suppose the number of the thousands is dropped in our present copies.] And besides these, on which he put the greater trust, there were about 4,500 mercenaries. He had also 600 men as guards of his body. Now the cities easily maintained the rest of his army, excepting the mercenaries, for every one of the cities, enumerated above, sent out half their men to the army, and retained the other half at home, in order to get provisions for them, insomuch that the one part went to the war, and the other part to their work, and so those that sent out their corn were paid for it by those that were in arms, by that security which they enjoyed from them. End of Book 2, Chapter 20.
Book 2, Chapters 21 and 22 of the Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wars of the Jews by Josephus, translated by William Whiston. Book 2, Chapters 21 and 22. Chapter 21. Concerning John of Gischala. Josephus uses stratagems against the plots John laid against him, and recovers certain cities which had revolted from him. 1. Now as Josephus was thus engaged in the administration of the affairs of Galilee, there arose a treacherous person, a man of Gischala, the son of Levi, whose name was John. His character was that of a very cunning and very knavish person, beyond the ordinary rate of the other men of eminence there, and for wicked practices he had not his fellow anywhere. Poor he was at first, and for a long time his wants were a hindrance to him in his wicked designs. He was a ready liar, and yet very sharp in gaining credit to his fictions. He thought it a point of virtue to delude people, and would delude even such as were the dearest to him. He was a hypocritical pretender to humanity, but where he had hopes of gain, he spared not the shedding of blood. His desires were ever carried to great things, and he encouraged his hopes from those mean wicked tricks which he was the author of. He had a peculiar knack at thieving. But in some time he got certain companions in his impudent practices. At first they were but few, but as he proceeded on in his evil course, they became still more and more numerous. He took care that none of his partners should be easily caught in their rogueries, but chose such out of the rest as had the strongest constitutions of body, and the greatest courage of soul, together with great skill in martial affairs. As he got together a band of 400 men, who came principally out of the country of Tyre, and were vagabonds that had run away from its villages. And by the means of these he laid waste all Galilee, and irritated a considerable number, who were in great expectation of a war then suddenly to rise among them. 2. However, John's want of money had hitherto restrained him in his ambition after command, and in his attempts to advance himself. But when he saw that Josephus was highly pleased with the activity of his temper, he persuaded him, in the first place, to entrust him with the repairing of the walls of his native city, Gischala, in which work he got a great deal of money from the rich citizens. He after that contrived a very shrewd trick, and pretending that the Jews who dwelt in Syria were obliged to make use of oil that was made by others than those of their own nation, he desired leave of Josephus to send oil to their borders. So he bought 4 amphorae, with such Tyrian money as was for the value of 4 Attic drachmae, and sold every half amphora at the same price. And as Galilee was very fruitful in oil, and was peculiarly so at the time, by sending away great quantities, and having the sole privilege so to do, he gathered an immense sum of money together, which money he immediately used to the disadvantage of him who gave him that privilege; and, as he supposed, that if he could once overthrow Josephus, he should himself obtain the government of Galilee. So he gave orders to the robbers that were under his command to be more zealous in their thievish expeditions, that by the rise of many that desired innovations in the country, he might either catch their general in his snares, as he came to the country's assistance, and then kill him; or if he should overlook the robbers, he might accuse him for his negligence to the people of the country. He also spread abroad a report far and near, that Josephus was delivering up the administration of affairs to the Romans; and many such plots did he lay, in order to ruin him. 3. Now at the same time that certain young men of the village Dabarita, who kept guard in the great plain, laid snares for Ptolemy, who was Agrippa's and Bernice's steward, and took from him all that he had with him, among which things there were a great many costly garments, and no small number of silver cups, and 600 pieces of gold; yet were they not able to conceal what they had stolen, but brought it all to Josephus, to Taricheae. Hereupon he blamed them for the violence they had offered to the king and queen, and deposited what they had brought to him with Aeneas, the most potent man of Taricheae, with an intention of sending the things back to the owners at a proper time; which act of Josephus brought him into the greatest danger; for those that had stolen the things had an indignation at him, both because they gained no share of it for themselves, and because they perceived beforehand what was Josephus's intention, and that he would freely deliver up what had cost them so much pains to the king and queen. These ran away by night to their several villages, and declared to all men that Josephus was going to betray them. They also raised great disorders in all the neighboring cities, insomuch that in the morning 100,000 armed men came running together, which multitude was crowded together in the hippodrome at Taricheae, and made a very peevish clamor against him, while some cried out that they should depose the traitor, and others that they should burn him. Now John irritated a great many, as did also one Jesus, the son of Saphias, who was then governor of Tiberias. Then it was that Josephus's friends, and the guards of his body, were so affrighted at this violent assault of the multitude, that they all fled away but 4; and as he was asleep, they awaked him, and the people were going to set fire to the house. And although these 4 that remained with him persuaded him to run away, he was neither surprised at his being himself deserted, nor at the great multitude that came against him, but leaped out to them with his clothes rent, and ashes sprinkled on his head, with his hands behind him, and his sword hanging at his neck. At this sight his friends, especially those of Taricheae, commiserated his condition; but those that came out of the country, and those in their neighborhood, to whom his government seemed burdensome, reproached him, and bid him produce the money which belonged to them all immediately, and to confess the agreement he had made to betray them; for they imagined, from the habit in which he appeared, that he would deny nothing of what they suspected concerning him, and that it was in order to obtain pardon that he had put himself entirely into so pitiable a posture. But this humble appearance was only designed as preparatory to a stratagem of his, who thereby contrived to set those who were so angry at him at variance one with another about the things they were angry at. However, he promised he would confess all. Hereupon he was permitted to speak, when he said, "I did neither intend to send this money back to Agrippa, nor to gain it myself; for I did never esteem one that was your enemy to be my friend, nor did I look upon what would tend to your disadvantage to be my advantage. But, O you people of Taricheae, I saw that your city stood in more need than others of fortifications for your security, and that it wanted money in order for the building it a wall. I was also afraid lest the people of Tiberias and other cities should lay a plot to seize upon these spoils, and therefore it was that I intended to retain this money privately, that I might encompass you with a wall. But if this does not please you, I will produce what was brought me, and leave it to you to plunder it. But if I have conducted myself so well as to please you, you may if you please punish your benefactor. 4. Hereupon the people of Taricheae loudly commended him, but those of Tiberias, with the rest of the company, gave him hard names, and threatened what they would do to him. So both sides left off quarreling with Josephus, and fell on quarreling with one another. So he grew bold upon the dependence he had on his friends, which were the people of Taricheae, and about 40,000 in number, and spoke more freely to the whole multitude, and reproached them greatly for their rashness, and told them that with this money he would build walls about Taricheae, and would put the other cities in a state of security also, for that they should not want money, if they would but agree for whose benefit it was to be procured, and would not suffer themselves to be irritated against him who procured it for them. 5. Hereupon the rest of the multitude that had been deluded retired, but yet so that they went away angry, and 2,000 of them made an assault upon him in their armor; and as he was already gone to his own house, they stood without and threatened him. On which occasion Josephus again used a second stratagem to escape them; for he got upon the top of his house, and with his right hand desired them to be silent, and said to them, I cannot tell what you would have, nor can hear what you say, for the confused noise you make. But he said that he would comply with all their demands, in case they would but send some of their number in to him that might talk with him about it. And when the principal of them, with their leaders, heard this, they came into the house. He then drew them to the most retired part of the house, and shut the door of that hall where he put them, and then had them whipped till every one of their inward parts appeared naked. In the meantime the multitude stood round the house, and supposed that he had a long discourse with those that were gone in about what they had claimed of him. He had then the doors set open immediately, and sent the men out all bloody, which so terribly affrighted those that had before threatened him, that they threw away their arms and ran away. 6. But as for John, his envy grew greater upon this escape of Josephus, and he framed a new plot against him. He pretended to be sick, and by a letter desired that Josephus should give him leave to use the hot baths that were at Tiberias, for the recovery of his health. Hereupon Josephus, who hitherto suspected nothing of John's plots against him, wrote to the governors of the city, that they would provide a lodging and necessaries for John; which favors, when he had made use of, in 2 days' time he did what he came about. Some he corrupted with delusive frauds, and others with money, and so persuaded them to revolt from Josephus. This Silas, who was appointed guardian of the city by Josephus, wrote to him immediately, and informed him of the plot against him; which epistle when Josephus had received, he marched with great diligence all night, and came early in the morning to Tiberias; at which time the rest of the multitude met him. But John, who suspected that his coming was not for his advantage, sent however one of his friends, and pretended that he was sick, and that being confined to his bed, he could not come to pay him his respects. But as soon as Josephus had got the people of Tiberias together in the stadium, and tried to discourse with them about the letters that he had received, John privately sent some armed men, and gave them orders to slay him. But when the people saw that the armed men were about to draw their swords, they cried out; at which cry Josephus turned himself about, and when he saw that the swords were just at his throat, he marched away in great haste to the seashore, and left off that speech which he was going to make to the people, upon an elevation of 6 cubits high. He then seized on a ship which lay in the haven, and leaped into it, with 2 of his guards, and fled away into the midst of the lake. 7. But now the soldiers he had with him took up their arms immediately, and marched against the plotters; but Josephus was afraid lest a civil war should be raised by the envy of a few men, and bring the city to ruin. So he sent some of his party to tell them that they should do no more than provide for their own safety; that they should not kill anybody, nor accuse any for the occasion they had afforded of disorder. Accordingly these men obeyed his orders, and were quiet; but the people of the neighboring country, when they were informed of this plot, and of the plotter, they got together in great multitudes to oppose John. But he prevented their attempt, and fled away to Gischala, his native city, while the Galileans came running out of their several cities to Josephus. And as they were now become many 10,000s of armed men, they cried out that they were come against John the common plotter against their interest, and would at the same time burn him, and that city which had received him. Hereupon Josephus told them that he took their good will to him kindly, but still he restrained their fury, and intended to subdue his enemies by prudent conduct, rather than by slaying them. So he accepted those of every city which had joined in this revolt with John, by name, who had readily been shown him by these that came from every city, and caused public proclamation to be made, that he would seize upon the effects of those that did not forsake John within 5 days' time, and would burn both their houses and their families with fire. Whereupon 3,000 of John's party left him immediately, who came to Josephus, and threw their arms down at his feet. John then betook himself, together with his 2,000 Syrian runagates, from open attempts to more secret ways of treachery. Accordingly he privately sent messengers to Jerusalem, to accuse Josephus as having too great power, and to let them know that he would soon come as a tyrant to their metropolis, unless they prevented him. This accusation the people were aware of beforehand, but had no regard to it. However, some of the grandees, out of envy, and some of the rulers also, sent money to John privately, that he might be able to get together mercenary soldiers, in order to fight Josephus. They also made a decree of themselves, and this for recalling him from his government, yet did they not think that decree sufficient; so they sent withal 2,500 armed men, and 4 persons of the highest rank amongst them, Joazar the son of Nomachus, and Ananias the son of Sadok, as also Simon and Judas the sons of Jonathan, all very able men in speaking, that these persons might withdraw the good will of the people from Josephus. These had it in charge, that if he would voluntarily come away, they should permit him to come and give an account of his conduct; but if he obstinately insisted upon continuing in his government, they should treat him as an enemy. Now Josephus's friends had sent him word that an army was coming against him, but they gave him no notice beforehand what the reason of their coming was, that being only known among some secret councils of his enemies. And by this means it was that 4 cities revolted from him immediately, Sepphoris, and Gamala, and Gischala, and Tiberias. Yet did he recover these cities without war. And when he had routed those 4 commanders by stratagems, and had taken the most potent of their warriors, he sent them to Jerusalem; and the people of Galilee had great indignation at them, and were in a zealous disposition to slay, not only these forces, but those that sent them also, had not these forces prevented it by running away. 8. Now John was detained afterward within the walls of Gischala, by the fear he was in of Josephus; but within a few days Tiberias revolted again, the people within it inviting king Agrippa to return to the exercise of his authority there. And when he did not come at the time appointed, and when a few Roman horsemen appeared that day, they expelled Josephus out of the city. Now this revolt of theirs was presently known at Taricheae. And as Josephus had sent out all the soldiers that were with him to gather corn, he knew not how either to march out alone against the revolters, or to stay where he was, because he was afraid the king's soldiers might prevent him if he tarried, and might get into the city; for he did not intend to do any thing on the next day, because it was the Sabbath day, and would hinder his proceeding. So he contrived to circumvent the revolters by a stratagem; and in the first place he ordered the gates of Taricheae to be shut, that nobody might go out and inform those of Tiberias, for whom it was intended, what stratagem he was about. He then got together all the ships that were upon the lake, which were found to be 230, and in each of them he put no more than 4 mariners. So he sailed to Tiberias with haste, and kept at such a distance from the city, that it was not easy for the people to see the vessels, and ordered that the empty vessels should float up and down there, while himself, who had but 7 of his guards with him, and those unarmed also, went so near as to be seen. But when his adversaries, who were still reproaching him, saw him from the walls, they were so astonished that they supposed all the ships were full of armed men, and threw down their arms, and by signals of intercession they besought him to spare the city. 9. Upon this Josephus threatened them terribly, and reproached them, that when they were the first that took up arms against the Romans, they should spend their force beforehand in civil dissensions, and do what their enemies desired above all things; and that besides they should endeavor so hastily to seize upon him who took care of their safety, and had not been ashamed to shut the gates of their city against him that built their walls; that, however, he would admit of any intercessors from them that might make some excuse for them, and with whom he would make such agreements as might be for the city's security. Hereupon 10 of the most potent men of Tiberias came down to him presently; and when he had taken them into one of his vessels, he ordered them to be carried a great way off from the city. He then commanded that 50 others of their senate, such as were men of the greatest eminence, should come to him, that they might also give him some security on their behalf. After which, under one new pretense or another, he called forth others, one after another, to make the leagues between them. He then gave order to the masters of those vessels which he had thus filled to sail away immediately for Taricheae, and to confine those men in the prison there, till at length he took all their senate, consisting of 600 persons, and about 2,000 of the populace, and carried them away to Taricheae. [Footnote: I cannot but think this stratagem of Josephus, which is related both here and in his Life, section 32-33, to be one of the finest that ever was invented and executed by any warrior whatsoever. 10. And when the rest of the people cried out, that it was one Clitus that was the chief author of this revolt, they desired him to spend his anger upon him only. But Josephus, whose intention it was to slay nobody, commanded one Levius, belonging to his guards, to go out of the vessel, in order to cut off both Clitus's hands. Yet was Livius afraid to go out by himself alone to such a large body of enemies, and refused to go. Now Clitus saw that Josephus was in a great passion in the ship, and ready to leap out of it, in order to execute the punishment himself. He begged therefore from the shore, that he would leave him one of his hands, which Josephus agreed to, upon condition that he would himself cut off the other hand. Accordingly he drew his sword, and with his right hand cut off his left, so great was the fear he was in of Josephus himself. And thus he took the people of Tiberias prisoners, and recovered the city again with empty ships, and 7 of his guard. Moreover, a few days afterward he retook Gischala, which had revolted with the people of Sepphoris, and gave his soldiers leave to plunder it. Yet did he get all the plunder together, and restored it to the inhabitants; and the like he did to the inhabitants of Sepphoris and Tiberias. For when he had subdued those cities, he had a mind, by letting them be plundered, to give them some good instruction, while at the same time he regained their good will by restoring them their money again. CHAPTER 22. The Jews make all ready for the war, and Simon, the son of Gioras, falls to plundering. 1. And thus were the disturbances of Galilee quieted, when, upon their ceasing to prosecute their civil dissensions, they betook themselves to make preparations for the war with the Romans. Now in Jerusalem the high priest Artanus, and do as many of the men of power as were not in the interest of the Romans, both repaired the walls, and made a great many warlike instruments, insomuch that in all parts of the city darts and all sorts of armor were upon the anvil. Although the multitude of the young men were engaged in exercises, without any regularity, and all places were full of tumultuous doings, yet the moderate sort were exceedingly sad; and a great many there were also, out of the prospect they had of the calamities that were coming upon them, made great lamentations. There were also such omens observed as were understood to be forerunners of evils by such as loved peace, but were by those that kindled the war interpreted so as to suit their own inclinations; and the very state of the city, even before the Romans came against it, was that of a place doomed to destruction. However, Ananus's concern was this, to lay aside, for a while, the preparations for the war, and to persuade the seditious to consult their own interest, and to restrain the madness of those that had the name of zealots. But their violence was too hard for him, and what end he came to we shall relate hereafter. 2. But as for the Acrabbene toparchy, Simon, the son of Gioras, got a great number of those that were fond of innovations together, and betook himself to ravage the country; nor did he only harass the rich men's houses, but tormented their bodies, and appeared openly and beforehand to affect tyranny in his government. And when an army was sent against him by Artanus, and the other rulers, he and his band retired to the robbers that were at Masada, and stayed there, and plundered the country of Idumea with them, till both Ananus and his other adversaries were slain; and until the rulers of that country were so afflicted with the multitude of those that were slain, and with the continual ravage of what they had, that they raised an army, and put garrisons into the villages, to secure them from those insults. And in this state were the affairs of Judea at that time. Book 2, chapters 21 and 22. Book 2